So, we are here, and I hope that all of you are here because you really enjoyed this book, because it's actually one of my favorites. It's one that I discovered on this course, and as many of you know, I do crime fiction myself, and I don't write it, I research it, but it's actually, because of that, super interesting. So, we're going to talk about some of the reasons why it is particularly interesting in respect to adaptation, Hollywood, literature and film, and also, because I like it, the crime novel. So, this was 1947, just after the war, World War II, ended in 1945. And so we're very much in a world that is still in upheaval. Dorothy Hughes wrote a lot of different kinds of books. This book was published in 47, and it's very little known today. There were other women at the time who were writing this kind of fiction, which is usually known as hard-boiled or noir. And the most famous practitioners were Raymond Chandler, who wrote the classic sort of detective novels, all of which, the films of his novels, his Philip Marlowe novels, star Humphrey Bogart, which is very interesting. As do the films, some of the films made of Dashiell Hammett's novels, the sort of quintessential Private Eye Sam Spade, also played by Humphrey Bogart. So that's kind of an interesting thing that's going on. We've talked a little bit in the first term about the things that casting can do and the assumptions that people make about specific characters based on who's playing them. So we're going to talk a little bit about that. Not at all. There's some handouts there. So we're going to talk a little bit about that when we get to the film. This film has not been adapted again, although some others, like The Blank Wall, which is another novel by a woman around the same time, has been adapted twice. And there's a lot of quite famous stories, including Patricia Highsmith's Strangers on a Train, that also is around the same time. So, Hughes did write actually quite a few novels, but the interesting thing was they didn't all stay in the same mode. They were really different. She did some experiments. You can see in this novel, the voice is really different from what we might expect. And that's one of the things Hughes is interested in. She's interested in telling the stories of people whose stories don't get told. She wrote other novels that centered upon refugees, Native Americans, African Americans, and she did this kind of co-opting a male genre in order to specifically give attention to less powerful groups. Now here, she's doing something that is very rooted in the pulp or the noir, but it's kind of co-opting it to do something different and to ask some questions. She's setting up a conflict with the basic ideas of the hard-boiled. It shares a lot of the concerns with hard-boiled fiction. Raymond Chandler wrote a famous essay about detective fiction, and he said that the kind of novels he wrote were taking murder out of the drawing room and giving it back to the people who were really good at it. And you know, it's supposed to be gritty, it's supposed to be underworld, mafia, shady characters, etc., and the lone detective. He also wrote, as the definition of noir fiction is down these mean streets a man must go who is not himself mean, who is neither tarnished nor afraid. There's a lot of chivalry in this imagery. So Hughes is kind of going, Really? Is that really what's going on? Chandler shows heroes fighting against the world, whereas Hughes takes a different path and shows a man who is ostensibly playing this role, but is embracing the worst impulses of his own nature. Your quotation one is from Lisa Marie Hodgland, who wrote in the afterword to the Feminist Press edition. And she says, it's actually a really good essay, so you can look it up in the library even if you don't have that edition. Hughes uses the hard-boiled genre to explore from the inside the masculinist and misogynist ideas at its heart. So, this book is constructed in a very interesting way. It's third person, but it is a very monoperspectival point of view. We only see what Dick sees, and we don't see all of that. We're with the killer. We sympathize with him. But even though it's revealed that he is guilty, we don't even know that until like halfway through. Were you surprised by this? Or did everybody just know? I was quite shocked when I read it. I was like, well, that's interesting. So you get these hints that it might be him, but you're not sure it's him for a long time. So the narrative only reveals his perceptions, but in doing so, we also get hints about his anxieties, his obsessions, and we see him beginning to make mistakes. We see the flaws in his self-presentation, which principally occur in relation to the women in the story, and not with relation to the professional detectives. By doing this, by restricting this point of view, Hughes also does an interesting thing, that she withholds insight about other characters. So most of the other characters function only with relation to him, and our understanding of them is developed in a sort of secondary sphere. It's not in the main text. So this is very interesting. It's like how much it requires us to read into it. Christopher Brew points out that the narration brings the reader into uncomfortable proximity with Dix's thoughts, and crucially holds her at a critical distance from the full identification that would be promoted by a first-person narrative. So even though we do have some sympathy and some identification with Dix, we still can't quite get in there. We don't quite get his motivations, his reasoning. We don't really understand it. We get hints, but we don't get real revelations. We also only gradually discover the truth, as I said. Another really interesting thing is that Hughes is working in this very violent genre, but she never describes the actual acts of violence. They all take place off stage. So she is explicitly not pandering to the expectations of sex and violence in this genre. And that's really useful. She's pushing back against this trope, even while she's using it. There isn't a female protagonist as such, but it's Laurel and Sylvia who actually solve the crime, not the professional police officers. Another thing that I think is interesting is that if we didn't know the author's name, we'd probably assume this was a book by a man. Hard-boiled novels were usually written by men. And it's written in a very sort of masculine way. And one of the main questions in it is about masculinity, how to be a man. Of course, Dix's idea of how to be a man is a little bit different from everybody else's. So as I said, we're dealing with the aftermath of war. And it starts, the very beginning is Dix remembering what it's like to fly. He says, "It was good standing there on the promontory, overlooking the evening sea, the fog lifting itself like gauzy veils to touch his face. There was something in it akin to flying, the sense of being lifted high above the crawling earth, of being part of the wildness of the air. Something too of being closed within an unknown and strange world of mist and cloud and wind." So we're continually reminded of Dix's identity as a pilot and as a war hero. There's sort of two things that are happening here. First of all, we're creating from the very beginning this idea of the lonely place, the lone man, this sort of single individual against the elements. The other thing is, there was this fear, and it comes up in fiction after World War I as well, but it's really explicit in a lot of fiction after World War II. Lots and lots of crime authors particularly write about it, that soldiers came home profoundly altered, and people were afraid that the war had turned them into killers, that they were unknown quantities. We now know that something like 90% of soldiers in that war on both sides never fired their weapons. But we didn't know that then. And interestingly, a lot of the anxieties at this time are specifically centered around pilots. I was actually just reading an Agatha Christie novel for an article that I'm writing, and there's a character in it who was a pilot, and everyone's like, yeah, he could be a killer. Even though he's a really nice man. And he turns out to not be. But there's an idea that this sort of activity makes one suspect. And interestingly, other more contemporary things have picked that up as well. Post-Vietnam work, post-Iraq work also depicts the returned as potentially damaged, potentially psychotic. And nowadays, of course, we would call this PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. And so if you're looking at In a Lonely Place, we could think maybe this is what's going on, and some critics do read it that way. However, if we look back, Hughes is actually making it clear that Dix is a pretty nasty guy to start with. The war simply gave him a set of skills and a way to channel this. So quotation 4 is Dix's own reminiscence. The warriors were the first happy years he'd ever known. You didn't have to kowtow to the stinking rich, you were all equal in pay. And before long, you were the rich guy, because you didn't give a damn, and you were the best goddamn pilot in the company. You wore swell tailored uniforms, high polish on your shoes. You didn't need a car. You had something better, sleek, powerful planes. You were the mister. You were what you had always wanted to be, class. You could have any woman you wanted in Africa or India or England or Australia or the United States or any place in the world. So war offers money, status, clothes, machines, power, women. Absent from this are seeing something as work, the need to work. This may explain why Dix chooses to be a writer, if he is indeed a writer. We never really find out. But he is always haunted by these memories of war, and in a way, the war is the place he wants to go back to. Also, essentially, and we find this increasingly throughout the story, Dix is haunted by the memory of Brucey, this woman he loved. and who he probably killed. Like, it doesn't definitely say that, but it really definitely implies that. Dix is also deluded about this. He says, no, she loved him. But actually, the narrative gradually reveals that Brucey was married and probably turned Dix down. And so there's this real tension between what he's telling us and what we think probably really happened. And she does some very clever things with narration in terms of describing what Dix thought. So this next quotation is another place where we specifically deal with the notion of solitude, that's the word, solitude, and loneliness. The lonely place is internal more than it's external. So he's sitting on the beach. This is when he meets Betsy Banning, who's the last victim. He's lost in a world of swirling fog and crashing wave, a world empty of all but those things and his grief, lost in a lonely place. And then he meets Betsy, he smiles at her. She didn't know that behind that smile lay his hatred of Laurel, of Brabham Sylvia, of Mel Terrace, of old Fergus Steele, of everyone in the living world except Brucey. And Brucey was dead. So his hatred isn't just for women. It's not necessarily misogynist. It's for everyone, for people living according to any social convention. He hates. And we're given this long background about how he hates his uncle because he works hard in his hardware store, and how he envies his classmates at Yale because they have more than he does. So this is the culmination, his sort of satisfaction in war, and then after the war we see this unraveling. So there's this idea that the war sort of temporarily suspends this feeling of isolation, this hatred, but his return to civilian life reignites it. The lonely place that he describes is again here associated with nature, and then increasingly it's also associated with the memory of Brucey. But it also emphasizes his difference, his outsider status. So it becomes clear that although it may be external, it's increasingly internal. The lonely place is his mind, where he realizes that he's different, that he cannot be accepted into this society, even when he wanted to. The war was an aberration. He describes himself a couple of times as a lone wolf, which is quite telling. So there are some interesting things about this this particular self-characterization. One of them is that he seems to enjoy playing a role, particularly with Brub, his old friend. Yeah, it's a weird name, I don't know why. But he often says things like, in quotation 6, an ordinary man like you or me. So he's associating himself with the normal, with the standard. He's saying the killer is an ordinary man. Of course here, he's giving you a bit of a clue. But he's also trying to cast himself as an ordinary man. And he does so in this context so successfully that he gets to go along with the police a number of times. Now, he's really got them convinced that he's an ordinary guy, he's just interested in crime. Very odd. So through the conversations that the two of them have, Hughes demonstrates and argues through Dix that the killer is in many ways normal. And Christopher Brew remarks, the misogynist violence enacted by Dix echoes and indeed functions as a mere logical extension of the garden variety forms of misogyny that were an integral part of conventional masculinity in the 1950s. The novel thus refuses the distancing representation of its protagonist as abnormal or monstrous, breaking with the dominant conventions for representing murderers. So also, by arguing that Dix is an ordinary man, Hughes is also saying, yeah, this is what all men could be. She's really highlighting the potential of this genre and, by extension, this whole society in this masculinist, potentially violent culture. It's interesting that this happens, that this is set in the 40s, in this post-war world. And we often see these sort of idealized representations of this world. You know, the 1950s housewife with the appliances and everything is very easy and very nice, and oh, how convenient, you can have things ready for your husband when he comes home from work. So we're also talking about that. And the movie actually picks up on this in an interesting way. This is also probably coincidentally echoing reality. 1947 was the year of the well-known Black Dahlia murder case. It's a pretty gory case. There's a good novel about it, also quite horrifying, by James Ellroy. It's one of the most famous unsolved American crimes. And it was this hyper-violent murder of a young woman. And there was, of course, as there is today, there were people saying, oh, this comes from our films, this comes from our culture. And you know, no, but yes. Like a sort of, I sort of ally it to like Jack the Ripper in Victorian London. It gives us a sense of like the kind of crimes people would commit at that time. It seems in some way to be reflecting the identity of the society in a negative. So there's something that's quite interesting about the placement of the book in the culture. It's certainly not a coincidence that Dix is pretending to be a crime novelist. The novel actually characterizes crime writing very comically. It plays on the figure of the writer ending up in Hollywood, where dreams come true. Dix says he's writing detective novels. And Sylvia asks, who are you stealing from, Hammett or Chandler or Gardner? And Dix says, a little of each, with a touch of Queen and Carr. So they're saying both that this is a formulaic form of literature, and also that it's very easy, it's cut and paste, it's not creative. So in a way, Hughes is kind of poking a little fun at herself and at the reader. She's saying, oh, are you really challenged by this? Maybe you are. Probably you should be. But you might not even notice that challenge because you're consuming this popular form. This is something actually that a lot of crime writing does because it's not meant to be taken seriously. It's kind of allowed to say things that serious literature can't. It slips it in under the radar. It's an interesting phenomenon. If you start noticing it, you'll kind of see it everywhere. So Dix claims to be writing, and the writing is even his alibi at the end. But the only time we actually see him writing is when he writes a letter to Uncle Fergus asking for some money. he's a man we do see trying to compose his own thoughts and to explain things to himself. But he often gets distracted. His thoughts can have this sort of lyrical quality. As sometimes happens in Chandler, they can become very romantic, capital R, or heroic. He sets up this kind of romance with Laurel, this idea of the lady to whom he's paying court. It's very formal. He also acts as a detective in a way, and sometimes a detective of himself. He's digging at his motivations, and although he usually refuses them when he actually gets an answer, he still is asking questions. He's also, at one point, trying to figure out what he's doing during his blackouts. Betsy's murder, particularly, takes place during this narrative ellipsis, and Dix wakes up with sandy sheets. It's unclear if we're just not being told about it, or if he, in fact, has no memory of it. So, there's a kind of competition in this novel about who is the detective. The police are present. One of the main characters is a police officer. But somehow they don't seem like the real detectives. They don't seem like they're really figuring stuff out. Hughes is using this idea of the serial killer before the term is really used very much in common discourse. But that's definitely what she's talking about. And your quotation 9 quotes Jill Plain, who's a very well-known theorist of crime novels, and she says the serial killer narrative facilitates a decentered and destabilizing approach to the detective hero. These fictions present a narrative of proximity, the discourse in which the other proves uncomfortably similar to the bourgeois individual self. So there's this literal proximity that Dix is close to the investigation by being friends with Brubb. He also says it's research for his novel, but he has this unquenchable fascination with a process that's actually aiming to catch him. However, he's never set up as a real threat, Brubb. We don't see him doing a lot of detecting. Again, it's the women in the book, Sylvia and Laurel, who are really the killer's undoing. And that's largely because he doesn't see them as equals. At one point he says Sylvia's eyes were disturbing. They were so wise, as if she could see under the covering of a man. But he doesn't actually credit that she can. So Laurel is an interesting character. She's cast initially as a femme fatale. She's very beautiful. She's a bit elusive. He doesn't really know everything about her. But she's the one who figures out what's going on. She and Sylvia make the plan to capture him. Skipping around here a little bit, sorry. Yeah, okay, that's fine. Oh, one moment. And Sylvia is also a fairly complex, Sylvia is also a character who seems to be more suspicious than we think. She seems to be more suspicious than Brubb is, which is interesting. So somehow these women are actually the people with whom Dix is not careful enough. He doesn't play his role well enough. There's also an association between the women and this sort of romantic idea of Hollywood. And this is sort of where the Hollywood novel comes in. The pictures is dismissed by Dix. He says, if I ever write for the pictures, lady, it will only be because I need the money. So he says, no, I'm writing a novel, I'm serious. But there are all these instances in which the movies come up. The first victim is Mildred Atkinson. She's a stenographer working in Hollywood, by implication in the film industry, and she's seen going into a coffee shop with a man, and someone in the after-movie crowd must have seen them. So there's this idea of spectators. At his first glimpse of Betsy Banning, Dix asks if she's in pictures. Sylvia says she's rich, she doesn't need the pictures. So again, there's this class thing going on. But her body is also found by two top movie stars who live in the Fairbanks house. This is another alliance to the 1920s film star Douglas Fairbanks. And the fictional name of one of those movie stars, Paul Cheney, connects to Lon Chaney, who was a horror actor. So we have the glamour of Fairbanks and the horror of Cheney together at this point. And this is also kind of telling us something about how our ideas of films function. There's this idea of a facade of extreme wealth and luxury, which is in a way opposed to actual extreme wealth and luxury. But this facade also involves acting out violence for entertainment purposes and asking how far away is that from actual violence. There's a couple of moments where Dix is very dismissive of sensationalism and reflects a little bit the narrative we saw of Todd Hackett in Day of the Locust. He says the publicity on this one would be a feast to the peasants who got their thrills from the newspapers. So there's this critique of the media, of culture industry through this whole thing. There's also, on Dix's part, as always, a really condescending attitude towards other people who just don't understand. There's a suggestion about Laurel that she has been in films, but she's now studying acting and elocution. She's aiming higher. And then there's an idea that she is going to be in a Broadway show, so she now then thinks, okay, well, that's my dream. So she's able to kind of bounce back and forth within this structure of performance, of glamour. There's also an interesting suggestion, and this is not very Hollywood, although it does come up, that she possibly has a relationship with Jess, who is this other actress. This obviously does not appear in the film. As you will have noticed, there are some significant changes. And Dix assumes, when she disappears, that she's gone back to her rich husband, who she's been trying to divorce. In fact, she's gone to Brub and Sylvia. And Sylvia is, in the end, the one who isn't interested in this glamour, but she's the one who traps Dix. Although, ironically, after she has risked her life to trap him, the police sort of push her aside to protect her, and she's like, sort of Hughes's final, told you so. So, Hughes is using the crime genre to explore from the inside these misogynist ideas at the heart of Hollywood storytelling, and showing us how the ideas of the contemporary culture are being reinforced through Hollywood entertainment and made more problematic. Hughes is kind of taking us inside the killer to show us that misogyny is part of his worldview. I mean, he hates everybody, but she's also asking if this is a particularly outstanding case of an average masculine characteristic. And so she's saying this kind of masculinity, by being exposed to this corroding effect of Hollywood, is sort of acting out this ultimate danger. So, now, the film. This film was made in 1950, which kind of tells us that the book was really popular, because that's a pretty quick turnaround. Popular book adaptation, boom, here you go, Humphrey Bogart, enjoy. It's very much a Hollywood film. We've had some significant changes. Stylistically, it's a film noir. Film noir was a French term that started being bandied about in the 1930s, and it has to do with high-key lighting. So there's lots of darkness, noir, on the screen. And it's meant to characterize strong emotion. So a lot of these things are very intense, very dark, literally and figuratively. I would not say In a Lonely Place is a really classic noir film, but it takes a lot of the kind of visual and operational cues from the noir film to sort of flag up to us what's going on and what the film is interested in. It's a pretty classic narrative cinema. It follows a straight line. It's using the techniques of noir to highlight a sort of moral ambiguity. Men in noir are often divided, as here, between the romantic hero and the criminal. You know, you'll have a detective who's on the side of right, but he has to break a lot of laws in order to solve the case, that sort of thing. He can be attracted to the wrong woman. There are some kind of wonderful instances of this, and the Big Sleep, The Maltese Falcon, those are classic noir films. And this is definitely playing upon those ideas. And as I said, even by getting the same actor to play the leading role, it's saying we're putting this in this specific narrative framework. Dana Poland calls the film one of cinema's most intense dissections of the violence of romantic relationships. And I think it's a bit much, but he says, In a Lonely Place shows a violence instilled within the heart of the dominant culture, ready to break out at any moment. But it's also important to notice that this critical dissection of male violence is situated within the film world itself. Hollywood isn't peripheral as it is in the novel, it's really central. The internal voice here is gone. We have an entirely external perspective. But most of the characters are connected to the film world. Most of them are jaded. Most of them are living on the fringes thereof. Dix, in this, is a writer. We know he is because he's written movies. But he's past his best, and his agent is trying to revive his career. But he's the problem. So I'm going to see if I can play something for you. I don't know if I'm going to be able to, but I'm going to try. There we go.
Don't you remember me?
I'm sorry, I can't say that I do.
Well, you wrote the last picture I did, the Columbia.
Well, I make it a point never to see pictures I write.
You, stop bothering my wife.
You shouldn't have done it, honey. No matter how much money that pig's got.
You pull over the curb.
Well, what's wrong with right here?
nobody.
She's right.
Dix, we'd about given you up.
Oh, hi, Mel.
Where you been? Come on, buy us a drink.
He's somebody. Lloyd Barnes, big director. Made all his money before the income tax.
So we've been calling you for the last 3 days.
You know me, if I don't answer the third ring, I'm not home.
Hello, Dix. Lloyd.
Hiya, Max.
Honey, let me have that book I left here for Mr. Steele to pick up with.
I'm almost finished with it.
All you've got to say is, I like it, and you go on salary tomorrow.
And I like it.
Oh, I think it'll make a dreamy picture, Mr. Steele. What I call an epic.
What do you call an epic?
Well, you know, a picture that's real long and has lots of things going on.
Could we have some matches for souvenirs?
Mr. Steele, could I keep the book until you come out? I only have a few pages to go. I know the end. I always read that first.
Sure, take your time. Good evening, Mrs. Steele. Good evening.
Remember, she's your audience.
Say that again to help me. I'll get another agent. Hiya, Charlie.
Let's get down to the other end.
What's the matter with right here? He's not contagious. All right.
So, this is setting up that that Dix is part of this community, but he's not a very stable part. Also, him saying, "I'm nobody," that's useful. That sort of ties into the idea of the lonely place, the idea that he is isolated. Although this little clip, and it happens again at the end of it, shows his temper. He's a very dangerous man, and the reason we learn why he's on the outs in Hollywood is because he has a terrible temper and he just attacks people. So then that makes us wonder. A fundamental change in this movie is that Dix is not a murderer. And we know that pretty much throughout the film. But there is this idea, and we've mentioned this before. Humphrey Bogart's not a murderer. We know that. Nowadays, we kind of have the opposite view. You know, like if you're watching a crime show and they have a really famous guest star, and you're like, well, she did it. Yeah, everyone has had this experience. Yeah. Because that's the idea, that's the juicy part. At this point, the hero did not do it. It's just a rule, he's a hero, he didn't do it. So there's something, it's almost kind of undermining it by casting. It's only maybe the 1960s that this starts to not be true. In the 50s, this is still true. And so in a way, it's undermining the storyline. In another way, it's quite interesting because we do still see him as a really ambivalent character. He has these spells of extreme violence, and in the end, he almost actually does kill Laurel because he's so angry. It's actually a great ending. Ending's the best part of the film. Dix shows a profound distaste for his own industry. He says, I never see pictures I write. But of course this scene, which is where it is, almost ends in a fist fight. His agent makes him sing a psychiatrist and Dix attacks the agent. Someone says Dix is like dynamite. He's ready to explode anytime. But it also shows this violence is ingrained in the Hollywood culture. In a way, something that's kind of interesting about him. The film is showing that his violence is not only fictional, though. He guesses a lot of the right things about who actually kills Mildred, for instance. But how that jealousy, the jealousy of her boyfriend who kills her, how that actually plays in. Has she triggered that jealousy by going with Dix to his apartment to tell him about the book? We don't know. I'm going to try to show you another interesting quotation. is actually a very annoying thing. This disc. Okay, so there's some interesting differences in this. As I pointed out, Dix himself is the biggest difference. We have the structure of the story is also different. It's not about a serial killer as such. It's about one unsolved murder. And this unsolved murder hangs above the whole trajectory of the story. And it makes a big difference as to how we see the individual characters, their interaction with this potential murder. Now this scene oh, that's not the right one. That's the one where, oh, not that one. Is it earlier? Ah, this one. So, this is a friendly dinner.
Oh, well, what difference does it make?
Make a great deal. She'd land in the lap of the LA Police Department instead of ours. All we know is that she was done from a moving automobile. No clues, no motives, no suspects.
Present company accepted. What about Henry, what's his name?
Who, Kessler?
Mm-hmm.
Well, after she called him and broke a date, he went to bed. His mother brought him a piece of pie. His father heard him snore. First thing in the morning, he came down to the station. He was terribly upset.
Substantial type, eats pie before going to sleep. Hey, what's wrong with you and Lochner? You don't see enough whodunits. We solve every murder in less than 2 hours. And some of them are tougher than the Atkinson case.
That's because you know who did it from the beginning.
Well, maybe you're right. Want me to help you solve this murder?
Always somebody would.
Well, first you have to have enough imagination to visualize the crime. Here, get up. Put this chair here. This one here. Rob, you sit down there. Sylvia, you sit there on Rob's right. Now, you're the killer. You're driving the car. This is the front seat.
What makes you so sure this murder was committed in the car?
Well, she'd been killed before she got in the car. The murderer would have hidden her body in the back. In that case, he couldn't have dumped her out without stopping. Now, you're driving up the canyon. Your left hand's on the wheel.
Yeah, go ahead.
She's telling you she's done nothing wrong. You pretend to believe her. Put your right arm around her neck. Now you get to a lonely place in the road, and you begin to squeeze. You're an ex-GI. You know judo. You know how to kill a person without using your hands. You're driving the car, and you're strangling her. You don't see her bulging eyes or protruding tongue. Go ahead, bro. Squeeze harder. You love her, and she's deceived you. You hate her patronizing attitude. She looks down on you. She's impressed with celebrity. She wants to get rid of you. You squeeze harder. Harder. Squeeze harder. It's wonderful to feel her throat crush under your arm.
Rob, stop it.
How did it hurt you tonight?
So, this, for all that it may be a bit overdone, significantly points out 2 things from the book. One is the kind of persuasive power of this character, Dix. The other is the inherent violence in even Brub because he's a man. So those are interesting things to find in a fairly traditional Hollywood movie. So we have the film industry itself in this scene, kind of giving us the impetus toward this violence. We also have a more, as in quotation 11, sort of subversive question of why all this is happening. As we saw in other films like Eyes Wide Shut, we have this sort of sociological power of film. we also have the ingrained violence of film, bound up, interestingly, with the need for success. If you're successful, you don't have to claw your way up, you don't have to hurt other people. But in order to be successful, you do. One of the other significant changes in the film is, of course, the female characters. In this film, Mildred Atkinson actually gets to be a character rather than just being dead at the beginning. She is the smaller romantic. And Dix is condescending and cynical. She's reading this book at the beginning. It's the book Dix is supposed to be adapting. He thinks it's awful. He's not even going to read it. So he brings her home with him to tell him the story so he can write it. And he calls it a meaningless Hollywood project. There's a little irony, because we do hear her tell him the story, and it mirrors Dix's story, if you reverse the gender roles. Thus, Dix's own life is reduced to this melodrama that he dismisses. Laurel, in the film, has been an actress, and Dix sort of still sees her as though she were an actress. And as he's writing the screenplay, he's in a way writing his own idealized life. She's also sort of desirous of vicarious success. She wants Dix to be a success. She also wants to be in his film. But, bless you, there's a kind of different notion of success. She becomes basically a housewife, taking on a very 1950s successful woman's role. So she's motivated to look after Dix, to take care of him while he's writing so that he'll be a success. But she also hopes she's going to get in the film. There's very little remaining of the other dimensions of her character, certainly not of any hint of her bisexuality. She has her masseuse, Martha, who she describes as the only thing left of her movie career, but that's not, it's only the vaguest hint of the novel's potential relationship. Even when Laurel becomes suspicious that Dix is a murderer, she's very reactive rather than proactive. She thinks of killing herself and then she tries to run away. She doesn't try to do anything to solve the situation. Sylvia, too, is much less active. She really only acts as a supporting character to Brub and as a foil to Laura, the woman who has the satisfactory life. All you could ask. So the gendering of the film is very traditional, very post-war. And we can link this behavior with Hollywood structures. Our last quotation refers again to where this main character falls. Dix is different and inscrutable, charming yet dangerous, yet his psychotic tendencies are disturbing, not so much because they're enigmatic, but because they reflect the power of the movie industry itself. He's really ambiguous, but he has these psychotic tendencies that play out in the way that a film does. Even in this scene, Brub, who is honest, who is honorable, is persuaded by a good storyteller to start strangling his wife. There's real power given to the act of storytelling. So this is the end of the discussion of Hollywood films and novels. Last week there was a real take on Hollywood itself, and this week more of a discussion of the things that Hollywood can potentially do as it gets under our skin and infiltrates the culture. So, we're asking a lot of interesting questions, and we can continue with some of these in